Hello and welcome back to another Cultist Astronaut video. Today we're going to be looking at the entity editor and some of the changes I've made to support sprite editing. So some of our entities are made up of sprites, which are just quads that we render a texture to. So for example, this saw blade, if we were to go into here and edit it, is actually composed of 3 sprites. And what I've done today and yesterday is I created this new section called sprites, and it lets you basically go through and modify where these sprites are located. You have all the tools here as well if you want to use the inspector. You can also rotate them, and yeah, you have the scale options. You can change the sorting layer and sorting order. The sorting layer is going to be a drop down in the future with a name. Technically there are names in the project, so if I go over here and I look up I believe it's called sorting layers index, you can see we have various layers that we use. A lot of these were exported and converted from Unity. So you can see layer 4 is characters. But theoretically you can go past this limit right now, so a little bit of an issue, but not too bad. And then you have sorting order, which lets you change the sprites within the layer. So if you have 5 things on the same layer, which right here we have 3 things and they're all on the same layer, but they have different sorting orders. And this is important for, layering our 2D scene, especially when you have like a parallax background, characters, foreground elements, and the tile maps. And then of course we can actually color or tint our sprites, so you can see we have that working, which is very cool. Our shader supports this, so we expose it here for the designer. And then this is the cool part. I got this texture view rendered, and basically if you click on a sprite, you can see we're modifying sprite 0. We can actually change, it's kind of hard to see because I'm rendering it behind. Let me move it over. But we can change which sprite region it's using. So this saw blade is rendered with a single texture. We can actually pack more sprites onto this if we want to make things more efficient. But basically we use one texture and then we use different UVs to map out the regions. And that just gets mapped to a quad. And you can see that all works pretty well. And yeah, this is pretty nice. I can save it, of course, and this gets updated in the scene. So if, for example, if I was to move this sprite and save this, and then close the window, you can see all of the saw blades have an offset. And that's our, our entity system in action. Entities are basically like prefabs. And whatever you do to the entity will be reflected in the scene. And you can see how fast it is. We actually iterate through all the saw blades in the scene and update them when you close it. And that's all based on the entity you're modifying. So that's pretty nice. And of course, when you save changes, you can see that inside of the saw blade entity, you can see we changed the position of the sprite to this number here. And I can discard that. And then of course if I do a reload, so let me open up Xcoria. Right now I don't have any type of like hot loading. Yeah, you can see this is an issue. So in order to fix that, we actually have to restart the game. So that's currently a problem with our asset system, is it doesn't detect file changes. So we'll be looking into that in the future, but for now it's fine. We don't really need that level of control. We're a small team and we can work around these edge cases. So yeah, everything's been reverted. You can see it's back to normal, and if I load Xcoria, you can see the saw blades are fine. Another thing that I worked on, and I think we were technically using this already for the tile map editor and the tile editor itself, but we do have a grid. So when I edit this entity, you can see we have a grid that we can use for positioning things, In the future, I would like to make it so we can snap to coordinates, but yeah, right now it is here to serve as a guide. So if I move this over, you can see it is basically 1. So everything will snap to this grid, which is great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the code. I want to make sure that I'm including code in these videos so other people can see what we're doing. So this is the code for the UI. So you can see here we have like a collapsing header. I'm using Dear IamGUI, which is a library that you can use for immediate mode UI, which is how we're building the entire UI in the editor. And you can see we have different levels of control, so we can do deletion. And basically there's some code here that will remove a sprite from a buffer. And the cool thing is when we open this tool, we actually load all the sprites into a buffer that we can edit. And then when we save the entity, we actually take that sprite buffer, we pack it back down, and we put it into the entity. And so everything we're doing inside of the editor is actually very temporary, and it doesn't modify the asset until you hit save. And that's a trick that makes this deletion really easy because we can actually track vacancy. So you can see here we have an if check that says, hey, is this slot vacant? And yeah, if it is, then, or if it isn't, then you can see we can select the previous sprite, which is what this is for. This actually allows us to select a previous sprite. But for addition, you can see we can actually grab the next vacant item. And we do that by iterating through the buffer and say, okay, here's the next vacant item. And the for loop is pretty fast, mostly because the memory is contiguous, but also there's not that many elements. So this for loop is basically free. There's not really much going on here except finding the next vacant thing. We're not dealing with thousands of sprites, so this isn't a big concern. And then of course we have to do some reallocation. I'm going to do another pass over this code and probably simplify some of the logic and maybe pack these into somewhat reusable code because this pattern actually exists in a couple places. But basically this buffer is limited in its size, and we have to allocate another buffer when it reaches its capacity. So as you can see here, we start off with 8 sprites, and then let's say you add a 9th sprite. Well, this function will make sure to reallocate that buffer, and we do a couple of mem copies and mem sets to make sure that the data is transferred over to the new buffer. And then of course we're able to add it. The rest of this kind of just loops through this buffer, and if it's not vacant, then it renders a selectable. So this is how we select the different options in the list. These are what you call selectables. And selecting just changes the selected sprite index, which we actually use down here to display the information. So you can see we have position, rotation, scale, etc. And IamGUI actually uses the name as a unique identifier. So what we have to do to make sure they're truly unique is we have to do this ## sprite. And you can actually see if we look up position, which is going to be above, we actually use this in a couple spots. So let me see here. Yeah, you can see here for the transform of the entity, we have position ## transform. And that's important because if we don't do the ##, then IamGUI thinks we're modifying the same input field, and it will actually change both values. So it will change the sprite and the entity's position. So you'll see we do this in quite a few places to make sure that things are unique. But yeah, these are all the tools that you saw earlier. And then this behemoth of a function basically loops through the regions and renders the texture. So you can see we're adding an image. We're using the draw list feature to do this. Draw lists are really cool because they let us do more custom things with IamGUI. And yeah, that is how we render the texture. This is how we render the little boxes you see. So we have the selected box and the non-selected box. So earlier you saw here when I click, it actually selects the region. And that's exactly what this code here does. IamGUI has a dummy function which allows us to insert a sized element. And what this basically does is it treats this box, this custom element that we rendered, as a UI element, which basically allows us to space this out so that the save button appears at the bottom. If we didn't do the dummy call, save would actually be right here, because the way IMGUI works is every time you render a new element, it goes down the y-axis. And so we insert a dummy element to make sure that it doesn't put this here. And the reason we have to do that is because this is a custom UI element. And yeah, we have a save function, and just briefly, because I kind of went over it at the beginning of this, but when we save it, we have to actually pack. You see here we have pack sprites into entity. And that sounds kind of scary, but it's really simple. All it does is it loops through the sprites in the entity editor. Remember, this is a temporary buffer that we're modifying, and it checks to see if it's vacant or not. And if it's not vacant, then we copy it into the entity sprites list. And packing just means that we only pack it in. We don't have any gaps, right? You can think of this as like defragmentation, where we're removing all the gaps and then putting it back into the entity. And then, of course, what we do is we write the file out. So this is how we get the changes to our disk. And then this is the important part, right? This function here updates all of the entities. So I could even say update entities in the world to reflect changes in the entity. So when I add new sprites, we're able to loop through. We have this check here to see if it's updated. And basically this just updates the array for that entity. And it's very fast, as you saw. It doesn't take any time to do this. So yeah, that is what I worked on mostly yesterday and a little bit of today. The next thing that I've been working on heavily is the slicing tool. So the texture editor also got an update. So you can see here that we can actually click edit on a texture. And this view used to just show us like a very plain view of this texture. Now we have this nice grid in the background, and we have the same like selection UI. We have a nice little pivot icon. A lot of this is inspired by Unity. I think Unity's Sprite Editor is actually pretty good. And yeah, these are some of the new regions I've added today. And you can see we kind of have a similar list to the sprites, where I can actually like select them over here. We can give them names if we want. So like this is a sparkle, so I can call this like spark 1. And you can see that updates the list name as well. I can change the size of these things. So if I want to make this like, or if I want to move it, I can do that. I can also make it bigger. So you can see I can stretch it out. I don't have any like undo redo functionality yet. That's like a big item on my to-do list, but yeah, I can just adjust it back. And then of course I can add new regions, and you can see we have a new one. It puts it down here for now. I kind of want to make it so you can like click and drag, so you can draw these. And I also want to add a zoom feature, but right now that's kind of buggy, as you can see. So that's work in progress. But yeah, I can actually adjust these and get them into place. The zoom feature is going to make this super easy, because I'll be able to actually see what I'm doing up close. But yeah, I mean, you can basically get it in there. It works much better for the bigger elements like these. And it looks like there's some bugs with the pivot when I change the zoom factor. So that's something to figure out. Let me go back in here. Yeah, I think generally it works if I don't zoom. Zoom is a new feature, so we need to work on that. But yeah, that's work in progress. And this is going to make it really easy for us to import new textures, modify them, and then form new entities. So basically, what we can do, right, is up here I can say, okay, let's create a new entity. This is technically a template for a enemy, so I have to turn off all these settings. And let's add a sprite. Let's select crystals. Let's use this crystal for our first sprite. And then for the second sprite, let's do the same texture. We'll use the pickaxe. I'm going to scale this pickaxe down to 0.5, and I'm going to move it up, rotate it. And what I want to do is kind of stick it into this rock. So let's do it like this. And then I want this pickaxe to render behind this this crystal. And so for both sprites, I want them to be on layer 4, which is where the characters are. And then I want this one to be behind it. So we'll keep this on 0, and then we'll make this, we'll make this 1. And now the pickaxe is behind it. And I kind of want to adjust this so that it's a little higher up. And then let's rotate it just a bit more. Wondering how I want to do this. I can also use this gizmo here to position things. Yeah, and I already made an asset like this, so that's why I was good at positioning these numbers, because I knew ahead of time. And then I can name this to, let's see, Jade Crystal, and I'll call it 2 because we already have a 1. And we can click create, and you can see now it changes the create button to save, which means if I want to change this, I can. And if I want to spawn this in, I can type in Jade Crystal, and I can spawn it into the scene. And another thing I worked on today to make this work really nicely is there is technically a sprite hierarchy. It's very simple right now. Basically, the entity is the parent, and then the sprites are the children. And so if I rotate this object, you can see that the sprites stay relative to its parent. They don't rotate on their own. And the same thing's true if I use scale. So if I want to make this really big, you can see everything moves relative to that point. And yeah, I can put this here, and then I can do, you can see it put it into the root. I want to actually put this into the hangar intro, so it's part of this room. And then I can save that out. And let's just jump to a different world for now. And let's jump back. And you'll see the jade stone is still here. And of course, I can see all these changes inside of the what is this called? Version control. It's late, and my vocabulary engine is shutting down. But you can see we've added a new entity to room 86, and it's asset 240 whatever. And in the asset index, you can see we created a new Jade Crystal 2 with the same ID. And so everything there is working. That's awesome. And yeah, that's basically the workflow that we will be using to decorate our scene with sprites. And of course, we can create things like saw blades, which deal damage, and they're composed of sprites. Yeah, and every entity you see here can be modified, right? You can see this is the door. It has 2 sprites. This should be 1 texture. So Harlan will be going through and improving the texture sheets so that we're packing as much as we can onto sheets. But yeah, this has been a really fun tool to add to the engine. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I hope you have a wonderful day. See you next time.